You're syncing up and tuning in to the Lending Link podcast, powered by GDS Link, where the modern day lender can dive deeper into the future of data, decisioning, and credit risk solutions. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm your host, Rich Alterman, and on this episode of the Lending Link, we're sitting down with Tom O'Neill, who is a risk advisor at Equifax, one of the national credit bureaus in the U.S. and Canada, with a presence in 23 other countries. Tom brings over 20 years of experience leading analytic consulting engagements within financial services and other industries. As a risk advisor at Equifax, Tom provides analytical thought leadership to clients, senior management, public forums, and various industries and advisory councils. Tom holds a Master's of International Management from the American Graduate School of International Management and a dual Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Philosophy from New Mexico University. In this episode, Tom and I are going to spend some time talking about current market trends in lending, current state of the economy and what lenders can do to prepare, and the use of alternative data, and so much more. But first, please head over to GDS Link's LinkedIn and Twitter pages at GDS Link and hit those like and follow buttons. And please be sure to subscribe to the Lending Link on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast. All right, now let's get synced with GDS Link. Good morning, Tom, and welcome.
Morning, Rich. Happy to be here.
So where are you joining us from today?
Today, I am in Philadelphia, where it's always sunny, apparently, or so they tell me.
Okay, well, great. I enjoy Philadelphia. Spent a lot of time up there. I lived in Newark, Delaware for several years with American Express. So, Tom, you've been in your current role at Equifax for 2 years. Maybe spend a little time telling us about your background before stepping into your current role, as well as before starting with Equifax.
I've spent a career in the bureaus, so to speak, and been able to do a lot of different things within there, which has been an adventure and a lot of fun, but all focused around helping our clients understand and utilize the data and information that we can provide to them. So, for instance, credit trends, what do those mean? What does that mean from a risk perspective? How can we take action on those? The data itself, what's available, how can that be used in decisioning? And for a long time, I was heading up optimization groups where, really pushing math to the limits to say, what is the data telling us that we should use or to do to maximize our performance given the constraints that we've got. Currently, I'm in a role of risk advisor, which, as the name entails, essentially helps clients understand the environment that we're in and what they can do proactively and even reactively in some cases to adjust to those environments and use the information at their disposal to come out good on the other side.
So, one of the things I like to do before I kind of dig into business is just maybe get a little more personal. Reviewing your LinkedIn profile, I see that from August 2015 through March of 2018, you started and operated a restaurant in Virginia called the Hatch Grill.
Yeah.
And the description indicates it was a pay-it-forward restaurant. Can you please share with us what it meant that it was pay-it-forward, and what was your motivation for starting the restaurant to begin with?
Yeah, what is a pay-it-forward restaurant after all? So as you noted in my my bio, I graduated from New Mexico State University, and when I was there, I fell in love with New Mexico food, which I think anyone who has taste buds who goes to the Southwest and has it, is going to do. And when I came out to the East Coast and I started my career and settled down here, that was one thing that was missing. So I had actually been wanting to do a for-profit enterprise that had more of a community focus to it. And the more I thought about it, the more I kept coming back to this notion of a pay-it-forward restaurant. Mm-hmm. And what that is the way we had our restaurant set up, someone would come in, they would order the food. It's kind of set up like a Chipotle or a similar type thing where you go down the line and you create your meal.
Right.
And at the end, you pay for the meal, and for a couple dollars extra, you can buy a certificate. And that certificate then went up on one of the walls, within the restaurant. And someone who could use a meal but might not be able to afford it could come down, take that certificate off the wall, and exchange it for a menu item. And in turn, they get a thank you certificate, which went up on another wall in the restaurant. So
very cool. Very cool.
It was this really cool dynamic. And really, it was that whole pay it forward notion that was a bigger driver to me than actually opening up a restaurant. But I figured if I'm going to open up a restaurant, it's going to be New Mexican food. So I'm going to kill two birds with one
Right.
stone and do things that I really like. And it was wonderful. We ran it for a few years, and the whole pay it forward dynamic was really rewarding to see. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to work out when we started, but it worked out beautifully. After a few years, though, I realized, I was much more interested in starting a restaurant and doing this concept than I was actually spending the rest of my career running a
Right.
restaurant. So ultimately sold the restaurant, and I rejoined my previous career, which I've been back doing for good 4 years now, five
Right.
years now.
Right. Sounded like a really good cause. So real quickly, if someone said, "What's the difference between New Mexico food and Mexican food?"
I get that all. Basically, it's the chilies. Basically, it's
Okay.
the chilies. Yeah. So there's a lot of similarity between like Tex-Mex and
Right.
New Mexican. Yeah. So you'll get burritos. You'll get carne adobada and all those
Uh-huh.
things that you can associate. But New Mexico is where the Hatch chilies are grown. That's a passion into itself, and that's why we called it Hatch Grill. It was because we actually brought the chilies from Hatch, New Mexico, out to Northern Virginia. When we were first setting up the restaurant, we had people who were from New Mexico that would poke their heads in the door and say, like, "Are you really New Mexican food, or are you just calling it?" That's
Right.
it.
Right.
And so when we told them that we were bringing the chilies from Hatch and that we were authentic.
Yeah, let's get down to business. As you
Sure.
shared as part of the advisory service, you'd produce a lot of data studies that focus on key trends in the market that can impact your clients. So let's spend some time discussing some of the observations you and your team have made
Sure.
based on the data that you've gleaned from examining consumer and business credit files. So looking at your profile, I understand that while at Experian, upon the onset of COVID and the CARES Act, that's really when you became responsible for producing weekly market insights and summary reports. So, when we think about COVID and the CARES Act at the time, we had forbearance, we had deferments, concerns about the value of a credit file. What were some of the insights and recommendations that you were bringing to the table at the time during COVID and the CARES Act as those were really hitting our economy hard?
Not that we're not in interesting times still, but that was a period that I don't think had ever. We don't have an equivalent, of
Hmm.
that early 2020 through 2020, really, where the immediate reaction to COVID, and even more than the pandemic itself, was the effects of the pandemic. The isolationist, society. We everyone was indoors. Spending fell off a cliff, and possibly even more importantly, no one knew what was coming next.
Right.
Was this sort of the new normal? So, understandably, from a lending perspective, the natural reaction was to withdraw. It
Hmm.
was just to stop it and see what happens before we make any other determination. And as you said, we also rolled out the CARES Act and all of the reporting guidelines that came with that, with the intent of helping our consumer base, helping all these households weather this storm that we didn't know what the ultimate severity
Right.
was, or the duration of it was going to be. And I would say, for the most part, from all the data that I've seen, it looked like a lot of what the CARES Act was put in place for did its job. We did sort of avoid that tsunami of delinquencies and charge-offs that a lot of people were concerned about. But it did raise a lot of the questions that you bring up with forbearance and payment holidays and even the stimulus checks that went
Yep.
out. Is this creating an environment that really is artificial? It's not sustainable, and it's creating a this picture of consumers who are more credit worthy than what they really are underneath, without all of
Hmm.
these things propping them up. And that was a legitimate concern. And we did see things like the average scores increasing over
Yep.
time. So we saw, a 720 was now a 740. And it's important to understand, it's not that the those scores were no longer working. They do work as well as they ever have in terms of distinguishing higher risk and lower risk consumers. The difference, though, was the underlying activity that those scores were based off of. That was changing. So
Hmm.
when the CARES Act says someone who misses a payment can't be reported as delinquent, that changes things. The score is still, conveying that properly, but that situation itself is rather artificial. So that did lead to a concern that maybe a lot of this was just kicking the can down the road, and that when those deferments came off the books, when the checks stopped coming from the government, that we would be feeling the wrath of, of all this. And fortunately, that tsunami that I mentioned before has seemed to have been avoided. We didn't have that big catastrophe. But it did raise a question in a lot of people's minds of, can we just rely on the traditional scores?
Yeah.
And one thing that I've consistent and we as a group have consistently gone back with is those traditional risk scores are just as relevant today as always. They still work. They should still be a fundamental part of credit decisioning. But we're now at a point which really, the trend towards this had started even before COVID, but COVID has
Mhm.
exacerbated it. We're at a point where you shouldn't, and in many cases you can't just rely on that. You
Right.
need to have, alternative ways of getting a holistic picture of the consumer, whether
Yep.
that's through other scores overlaid with those traditional scores, or some of the things that we'll probably talk about, alternative data,
Yep.
trend data, and things like that.
Let's kind of go back to the deferments and whatnot. I was reading one of the reports that you had sent to me to take a look at. One of the things that kind of struck me was when it came to bank card originations, in particular, and associated credit limits. That in the report on credit trends, it highlighted that September year to date of this year, there was a 15% increase in bank card originations, 22 versus 21. But over
Mhm.
the same time period, we saw credit limits increase by 36%, with the average credit limit on a bank card going to $5,100. So, was some of that phenomena where people were getting a lift in their scores potentially contributing to lenders pushing out higher credit limits? And if
Right.
so, are they potentially going to pay the price for that in the long run, especially now with what we're seeing in the economy?
It's a legit question, and there's actually a few things I think, that's underlying those trends that you mentioned. Some of them are a reaction to that shutdown in first quarter of 2020 when everyone just stopped and wanted to test the waters before getting back in. And one of the things that developed over the course of 2020 was when people were starting to feel a little more comfortable, lenders were starting to feel a little more comfortable. They not only saw that the risk levels may not have been as much as they feared it would be, but also the opportunities out there were strong. As we were starting to come out and consumer spending was picking up and people were doing things, a lot of lenders wanted to be right in there and be able to take advantage of the opportunities. Sort of that K-shaped economy that so many people have talked about, where yes, there are households that are truly impacted and are in a difficult situation, but there's a lot of households that have also actually come out quite well over the last couple of years, given the situation. And so that risk reward trade off is something that a lot of lenders have been wanting to jump on. So they want to be able to take advantage of those areas where there's growth opportunities, but at the same time, there's still a little bit of that. We don't know exactly what's coming, so they do so in as conservative a fashion as they can. So the upshot of that is that a lot of the that line increase that you're saying is that's going to the prime consumers. It's going to through credit line increases to to customers that have a track record of responsible behavior. And the originations themselves tend to go to those higher score consumers, which also have the higher lines associated with them. In fact, if you superimpose the subprime portion of those originations, you'll
Mhm.
see that that has trailed off negatively. More and more of those lines that are originated are going to prime consumers. And to your point, some of that may be impacted by those rising scores. But even as we've seen delinquencies tick up over the last couple quarters, they're moving up from next to zero. so
Yeah,
so on the
right.
one hand, you can say, oh, delinquencies they've been rising. It's like, well, but they were basically zero
Or
through
right.
most of 21. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
consumers were socking away a lot of cash and savings rates
right.
were up, right? But unfortunately now we're seeing the opposite. So through the data that we have at GDS Link, we have obviously a lot of hosted clients and we're able to get some visibility. So what we saw, Tom, was in April of 2020. There was a severe pullback in volume. And our hypothesis was that the buy box that lenders were setting with companies like Credit Karma, Credit Sesame, where they were, looking at leads, that they actually tightened up the buy box, right? So maybe having a higher Vantage or FICO score as a cutoff. And
Right.
then probably mid to late 2021, we started seeing volumes start going back up, but we definitely are
Right.
now starting to see volumes starting to trail off a little bit. So do you think that as we get more into 2023, that we might see some of that same phenomena at the same type of levels, or do you think we'll see it, but it won't be as pronounced?
I think more the latter. And there's so much that can potentially affect that. I don't think we're going to see what we saw in the first part of 2020 because like we said earlier, that was such a unique time where everyone almost overnight just sort of withdrew and said, a month ago no one was talking about COVID and now suddenly everyone's shut up inside and we don't know what's happening. That's a unique situation. And yeah, it's that dramatic cliff that everyone fell off of, everyone withdrew from. Now when we're looking for ahead and we're looking at originations, it's more, I hate to call it, more the traditional downturn, but it's more similar to what we've seen in the past, where
Hmm.
we look at economic downturns and the associated rise in delinquencies and drops in originations. I think we're looking at a little bit more along those lines than what we were seeing in early 2020. But I still think that this is even this, I say, traditional downturn, but even this is kind of unique in that more than in other times, we're seeing these divergences of households that are doing okay
Hmm.
and doing well, and those that are struggling. And what's unique from my perspective is that those different households, look so similar on your portfolio right now. So we
Right.
could have two consumers with a 720 risk score, but one owns their house, which has appreciated greatly in value over the last couple of years, and they're on a fixed rate mortgage. Maybe they work from home, and so
Right.
they're not, eating the price at the pump as gas prices rise. And then we've got the other who is renting and has
Hmm.
no choice but to absorb the costs of rising rent. Yes, over time, that will be reflected in those scores as one consumer thrives and the other one struggles. But right now, they look very similar. So it gets back to what we were talking about in terms of needing other ways of getting
Yep.
more holistic view into that consumer.
Well, I'm sure you saw the study that Lending Club published, right? That says
Mhm.
like what 65% of households now are living paycheck to paycheck, even
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
with six-figure incomes, right? So it's not
Yeah.
that they don't have the money sitting in a 401k, right? It's just that their
Right.
liquidity is an issue. They're seeing costs rise and they're starting to get squeezed.
If I remember that correctly, that was that 65, 66% was compared to what was it, 30% just a year ago?
Right.
Um, so it's, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? That we're saying, a third of the households out there have gone from doing okay to now living paycheck to paycheck, or not even able to live paycheck to paycheck over the course of 1 year.
And what concerns me is I think as we look at a lot of the layoffs we're reading about, I think this is going to be more of a white collar layoff event. You look at the announcement by Marcus, you look at the announcement by Amazon. I think these are going to be more corporate type jobs that take the hit. So you mentioned, we don't mention alternative data. You guys acquired CoreLogic Teletrack in 2021. I used to work there. You acquired DataX in 2019. You have utility data in your database now, and so you have an offering called One Score, which kind of combines all this information. When you're doing advisory, I think there's a perception, right? Well, if I deal with if I deal with prime consumers, is this data really going to help me?
I don't need alternative data. All my guys are
Right,
prime and
right.
super prime. Yeah, yeah,
I can remember at Teletrack doing a data study with a large card provider, and they were shocked, right, to see
yeah.
that some of their consumers were using payday loans. So when you're sitting down and doing advisory, kind of walk us through some typical conversations that you might have with your clients about alternative data. That's one
Sure.
question I have, and the other thing I was thinking about is on the utility data. and I think you might get that through your partnership with Jeanette, if I recall correctly. I think about my personal behavior is that, I use a credit card to pay for my utility bills because I want to get the points. So, any thoughts or insights you might share on there as well
Sure.
about the use of a credit card paying utilities, and therefore is the information I'm getting on the utility side somehow clouded by the fact that I'm using my credit card? Just to incorporate, discussions around open banking. You guys bought Account Score, and certainly we're seeing a big use of open banking data today. So maybe incorporating all that into your answer
So,
would be great.
wow, that's a whole lot to unpack there, Rich. The general topic of alts data is such a rich one, and as I mentioned before, it's one that had already started taking more and more relevance even before pandemic
Mhm.
and downturn and all the odd times that we've been in. But the environment over the last couple of years and what we're still in and going forward just exacerbates to that trend even more. And it all comes down to the ability to get that more holistic view of a consumer's financial and credit portrait. And historically, that was pretty much tied up with just the score. And again, taking nothing away from those, I still, when I'm talking with clients, I still say those are key components of any risk strategy. But now you want to overlay it with this alternative data. And a lot of people have the questions and reactions that you said. It's like, well, my portfolio is prime. These are not people going out to payday loans. But there's two things on. One is you'd be surprised
Right.
that every time we've done a hit rate analysis on these, it's more than clients think that it would be. And two, it's also around the definition of alternative data. It's not just payday loans. It's so many other
Right.
sources that ultimately is credit behavior. These are credit transactions, and these are people borrowing money and paying back that debt that does not get reported to the traditional CRAs, but they are true measures of someone's financial activity. And so that's why it's become more and more important to use a one score or some other form of incorporating these views into that picture. And you mentioned some of the utility data. In a vacuum, if I'm talking to a client that has all of the analytic resources and data consumption capabilities, at their disposal that they could possibly want, I would say bring in all of the data. Yeah, just bring it in, analyze what's relevant to you, and use that. That's almost never the case, though. No
Mhm.
one has unlimited resources. No one can just bring in all of the data, and so that's where these scores become so valuable
Mhm.
because that one score, for instance, takes data X, teletrack, utility data, as well as core credit data, and
Right.
says, here's a score based upon that. Insight scores, are another one where we take that alternative data and create something industry specific, so card or auto or things like that.
Mhm.
And it creates this much more digestible version of that alternative data.
Right.
But ultimately, it's all serving the same purpose. It's saying, let's start with that traditional view based upon my credit card activity, my mortgage, and all of that stuff. And let's layer in these views that are based upon the non-traditional
Mhm.
views. And that's where, in that situation that I described earlier, where we've got two 720s sitting side by side within your portfolio, that's where you're going to start seeing the distinction between those. That's
Right.
where you're going to start seeing, okay, well, Tom is a 720, but from a financial durability standpoint, from a overall risk, he may not be able to weather the current storms as well as Rich, who's also a 720, but is in a different situation economically.
Yeah. So when thinking about that, let's talk a little bit about trended data, right? So I think the adoption of trended data has been a lot, or has been growing over time. Remember when it really first started, and I think at that time the focus was more on the value in helping identify transactors versus revolvers on a credit card,
Right.
right?
Right.
But when you're advising your clients today who aren't using trended data, and you talk about those two guys with a 720, but
Right.
understanding how they got there and where they're going. Any insights on actual projects maybe that you worked on without obviously naming the customer, but
Sure.
the lift that they got from incorporating trending data, let's say into a model versus not using trending data?
Yeah, it's interesting because the justification for trended data has actually changed pretty dramatically in some of the conversations that I've been in from between now and 2, 3 years ago. Used to be that we could easily show the benefit of trended data. Take those two 720s that we're using, here, and simply, use a very simple trended data and say, hey, look, Tom's a 720, but 6 months ago he was a 750. So he's trending downwards. Rich
Right.
is a 720, but 6 months ago he was a 690. So
Hmm.
he's getting his financial situation in order, whereas Tom's starting to struggle a little bit. That was rather easy. And a lot of the same justification is still there today, but it's tempered a little bit because what have we been looking at over the last 6 months, year, 2 years, 3 years?
Hmm.
It's very unusual situation. So when we're talking about trended data now, we have to keep that in mind of is that trended data, which is still very relevant and gives a picture of where a consumer has been compared to where he is now, but is where he was, truly reflective of his ability to pay and financial strength. And so that's where we need to sort of not just go in and crunch numbers and say, whatever jumps out of the calculator is what we go with, but we actually put that human pair of eyes to it and make some subjective decisions of, okay, the data is telling us this, but let's temper that a little bit with what we know was going on 6 months ago, a year ago, and so forth.
Couple things I want to try to get to before we wrap up. The one thing you cannot escape today is discussions about buy now, pay later. I mean, I understand there's a tattoo parlor down the street that now has a BNPL tattoo that they're putting on people. So the CFPB just released a major report on buy now, pay
Hmm.
later. So it's certainly something that they're starting to focus on. Yourselves and TransUnion and Experian have announced
Right.
that they're going to start capturing buy now, pay later data, and you're doing it slightly differently, each one of you. But when you look at a true buy now, pay later product, which is, four equal installments, average loan of 200 to maybe $1,000. And we look at some of the stock prices going on with Varna and Affirm. What are some of your analytics or studies showing you as far as is it really a good representation, or do you think it will be a good representation of credit risk as we evaluate buy now, pay later data? And also, where is Equifax in its venture to get these companies to really start, reporting into your
Right.
platform?
Right. Well, I'll start with the latter part of that first, and that, as you mentioned, all three of the major bureaus are moving forward with capturing that information, albeit in slightly different ways, for each one. And a lot of us, not just within the bureaus, but also just the industry on a whole, we are looking at the CFPB to see what are they going to be doing. You mentioned the report that they just came out with a few months ago, where essentially they said we're going to be monitoring this. It is on our radar. We are looking to see what makes sense in terms of how this industry is regulated and reported, and for good reason. I mean, this as BNPL has grown, that's a lot of activity, a lot of credit activity that is sort of invisible to lenders.
Hmm.
And it's not so much of a concern of how much more risk does this create, although there is an element of that, but it's more of the fact that it's an unknown. It's
Right.
like we did a study, or we participated in a study where we said, if BNPL activity was reported, what would the impact be? And we saw that, based upon the performance of a lot of the information that was shared with us, a lot of consumers would benefit from having this
Hmm.
information reported in a more traditional manner. Of course, it all comes down to whether or not you're actually making those four payments as you should be and on time and stuff like that. But that's what we found. So while there's maybe a bit of a push to say, well, let's report this and let's get this incorporated, update their scores to reflect this new information accordingly. I think everyone's taking a step of saying, well, let's study it first. Let's see what the impact is. And I think the CFPB is as well, taking a look at that and
Yeah.
saying, before we rush into new regulation and new guidelines, let's see.
Yeah.
And so I think the step that the bureaus are taking with starting with capturing this
Hmm.
information, making it available to get this information, that's sort of the first step from my perspective of what the long-term approach is going to be.
Last topic to kind of talk about, given our time, you mentioned evaluating all this different data, traditional file and Teletrack and Data X and others. And recently, as you're probably aware, GDS has partnered with you guys with your Ignite, which is your analytics
Right.
platform. And through that platform, we can help build custom models for our clients where we can more easily evaluate the impact that this data can have on their scores and whatnot. Any plug you want to put in for the Ignite platform before we kind of start wrapping things up?
I love Ignite, and to me, it's the ultimate sandbox. Yeah, although product and marketing hate me calling it sandbox, but essentially that's what it's this environment where you can do exactly that. Where we can make this data available as our client are evaluating what the impact of bringing in different data to their processes and to their decisioning is. That's where they can do it, and the tools are there to do the analysis. The data is there. The client data can be uploaded, so you're looking at your actual
Hmm.
consumer base, and it just makes that whole process of evaluation so much easier. And then taking that and then deploying it into your process, like saying like, okay, we've brought in data X, for instance, and we've realized that we can benefit from using certain elements of that in these different situations. We can run that analysis. We can build models, calibrate models, and deploy those as needed. So to me, it removes one of the major obstacles that our clients have historically had in terms of being able to see and
Hmm.
recognize the benefits of all of these different data assets.
Yeah, and it lets them do it so much more quickly. And everyone's
Mhm.
about time to fund and making changes to their systems. So that's great. I appreciate that. So last question of the day before we wrap up. You were sitting down today with a rising college senior. What career advice would you give them?
Wow. Ironically, I have two college
Okay,
seniors
good.
as children right now, so this is a very pertinent question. And part of that is going to be a very hokey dad-like answer,
Okay.
and that is to focus on what you enjoy doing. And I know that is so clichéic,
Mhm.
and that is so like roll your eyes dad type answer. But the older I get, and the more that I do, the more I realize that there is so much truth in that. And the other part of that, which is actually kind of related, is that, and this goes for my freshmen going into college right now, is yes, it's important to get your degree and learn your trade and learn your subject, that you are interested in and going. But it's probably even more important to learn to think and
Yeah.
to reason through, and because what you're learning in college today is going to be obsolete in 3 years.
Right.
And so if you are able to learn to train your mind to adapt and stay interested in things, that's going to serve you much longer than what you're actually studying right now.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. When I started my first job in 1982 with Citicorp Retail Services, for the first 3 months I was living at my parents before I moved out to Long Island. And on Wednesday nights, I would say at dinner, it's hump day. And my father would say, "What's this hump day thing again?" I said, "Well, it's only 2 days to Friday, right? To the weekend." And my dad would look at me and say, "Rich, you're going to be working for another 45 years. If you spend your entire work week looking forward to the weekend and you're never looking forward to Monday, you need to get yourself a new job."
Wow.
Right?
Dads can be pretty wise sometimes,
Right,
can't
right.
they?
Well, Tom, thanks for joining us today, and I'd love to have you back. As I said, I think we touched on about 20% of the topics that we wanted to
Yeah,
cover.
we've got part two just
Yeah,
waiting to
we'll
be
have
queued
we'll have
up.
part two. Yeah. Well, anyway, this is Rich Alterman, and we have been syncing up with Tom O'Neill, risk advisor at Equifax. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast today, and we'll stay connected with GDS's The Lending Link to listen to future podcasts and catch up on ones that you may have missed. Tom, have a great day. Have a great weekend.